I want to thank the Kentucky Philanthropy Initiative for inviting me to speak today, and for the great partnership KPI has forged with the Cleveland Fed as we work together to understand and to find solutions to the economic challenges facing this region. Now, I appreciate this opportunity to not only to enjoy the beautiful bluegrass scenery, but also to gather firsthand information about economic conditions in this part of the country. Yesterday, I was able to observe an electrical fiber optic lineman training program at Hazard Community and Technical College, and I met with representatives of the Eastern Kentucky Concentrated Employment Program, the Foundation for Appalachian Kentucky, the Housing Development Alliance, and the Mountain Association for Community Economic Development. I found these discussions very, very productive. Now, Eastern Kentucky is part of the 4th Federal Reserve District, the Cleveland District, which also includes the state of Ohio, Western Pennsylvania, and the northern panhandle of West Virginia. Now, that's a pretty diverse region, encompassing larger cities, small towns, and rural areas, with a mix of different industries and occupations. The Federal Reserve System, established by Congress more than 100 years ago, was designed in a way to ensure that the Fed's decisions about monetary policy take into account this very diversity. We recognize that our policy decisions affect main streets and communities all across the country. Now, as the president of the Federal Reserve Bank, I make it a point to bring the economic information that we garner from business, consumer, and labor contacts throughout the district to meetings of the Federal Open Market Committee. That's the body within the Fed that sets monetary policy. The insightful regional perspectives that our contacts provide, along with economic and financial data and analysis, all play an important role in the Fed setting a national monetary policy in pursuit of our statutory goals of maximum employment and price stability. Now, while most people associate the Federal Reserve with monetary policy, that is, the people who've even heard of the Federal Reserve, the Fed has had an interest in community development issues for quite a long time. In 1981, the Fed created its Community Affairs function. With Paul Cabot, the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland leads our function, and very grateful for his works and efforts. And this was created to provide technical training and support to depository institutions to bolster their compliance with the Community Reinvestment Act, a law that promotes equitable access to credit for all individuals and neighborhoods. Now, from this targeted beginning, the Federal Reserve's work in the area of community development has evolved and expanded, much as the nature of community development in general has changed over time. As the people in this room know, access to credit is but one factor, albeit an important one, in determining the economic vitality of households and neighborhoods. Today, the Fed's community development function is active in research and outreach concerning housing markets, workforce development, education, health, and small business lending, among other issues. Now, while the focus may have changed over time, one thing that hasn't changed is the Federal Reserve's commitment to helping to identify effective policies and best practices for promoting economic progress in low and moderate income communities. The Cleveland Fed very much values the relationships we've built with philanthropic, government, and other organizations working on programs aimed at improving the economic outcomes of people in Eastern Kentucky. Those relationships were instrumental in informing our analysis of some of the community development efforts I'll discuss today. Now, I want you to know that the Cleveland Fed's work is just part of the initiatives taking place at the 12 Federal Reserve banks across the country. For example, the Minneapolis Fed has established a Center for Indian Country Development to forge partnerships between the Federal Reserve and other organizations to study business, housing, and educational issues affecting the Native American communities. The Dallas Fed's Colonia Project is examining infrastructure, housing, and economic opportunity efforts in the neighborhoods along the U.S.-Mexican border. And the St. Louis Fed's Delta Communities Initiative is working with distressed communities across the Arkansas and Mississippi Delta regions. There are many other examples, but today I will focus on approaches and programs that are helping to make a difference in regions like Eastern Kentucky, regions that are undergoing significant economic transformation. Before I continue, let me note that the views I'll express are my own and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve System or my colleagues on the Federal Open Market Committee. I guess you've heard that before. Eastern Kentucky, comprising 31 counties, has been facing economic challenges for some time. In 1964, President Lyndon Johnson knelt on the front porch of a Martin County family's cabin as part of his administration's War on Poverty tour. A photograph of that meeting became an icon in the country's effort to eradicate poverty. As discussed in two recent Cleveland Fed articles, while some progress has been made, the challenges remain substantial. In the 1960s, about 60% of families in Eastern Kentucky lived below the poverty line. Today, that percentage has fallen to around 25%, but that's still about twice as high as the national average and 9 percentage points higher than the rest of Kentucky. In fiscal year 2016, the Appalachian Regional Commission has designated 26 of the 31 counties in Eastern Kentucky as distressed. The sources of Eastern Kentucky's difficulties are familiar to all of you. Over the past decade or so, Eastern Kentucky has lost more than 13,000 jobs. About half of those were jobs in coal mining. The decline in employment has affected the regional economy in a number of ways. Coal miners earn nearly double the average annual income in Eastern Kentucky, about $73,000 per year compared to $36,000 per year. So the loss of those jobs has meant a sizable drop in local spending power. In addition, tax revenues derived from the coal industry have fallen sharply as the level of coal production has fallen. For example, the coal severance tax in Kentucky has dropped 40% in just the past 3 years. The weakened economy has exacerbated some social issues in the region. Eastern Kentucky has experienced the pain of the country's opioid epidemic. According to data from the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, over the period 2000 to 2014, the age-adjusted death rate from drug overdoses more than doubled, with opioids being the main driver of these deaths. According to this sad metric, in 2014, Kentucky's death rate from this cause was the fourth highest among the 50 states. The economic challenges in Eastern Kentucky are also reflected in population trends. While the rest of Kentucky has gained population since 1980, the population in Eastern Kentucky has been fairly flat and has even begun to decline over the past 5 years as the coal industry has contracted. Deaths are now outpacing births, and net migration in Eastern Kentucky has shifted from an inflow of around 1,300 people a year on average from 1995 to 2011 to an outflow of about 1,100 people a year on average since then. Eastern Kentucky is not alone in facing economic challenges, many of which arise from the transformation being driven by technological change and globalization. In the 4th Federal Reserve District, regions that have been dependent on one particular industry, like heavy manufacturing or oil, have fared less well over time than those that have been able to diversify their industrial bases and adapt to the changing economy. Research and analysis by Federal Reserve staff and others have identified a number of specific factors that support regional economic transitions. The 3 I'll discuss today are leadership and collaboration, a skilled workforce, and infrastructure. Now, effective leadership can make a big difference in how regional economies navigate transitions. The Boston Fed examines small and mid-sized cities that lost manufacturing employment and found that resurgent cities, meaning those cities that successfully reinvigorated their economies, exhibited a high degree of leadership and collaboration among key institutions and individuals, including nonprofits, private citizens, corporations, and government. But the researchers also found that to have an effect on economic outcomes, leadership and collaboration must be part of long-lasting campaigns. There are no shortcuts or easy fixes. Fortunately, we are seeing some encouraging signs of leadership and collaboration in Eastern Kentucky. I think this summit is a great example of a broad cross-section of funders coming together to support economic transitions. The Kentucky Philanthropy Initiative is aligned with the Appalachia Funders Network and the Appalachians Regional Commission, both of which are active partners of the Cleveland Fed, as well as the Richmond and Atlanta Feds, whose districts encompass parts of Central Appalachia. In fact, Federal Reserve staff members participate in 4 work groups operated by the Appalachian Funders Network related to health, food systems, strengthening community capacity, and energy and natural resources. Our staff members are actively engaged with our regional partners to aid in data analysis when possible and to foster leadership connections and information sharing. Leadership and collaboration also affect the success of employers in recruiting newly trained workers into their industries. Cleveland Fed analysts undertook case studies of 5 sector-based initiatives across the 4th District. These sectors were healthcare in Western Pennsylvania, information technology in Northeastern Ohio, advanced manufacturing in Central Ohio, marine mechanics in Northwestern Ohio, and coal mining in Eastern Kentucky. 4 of these 5 initiatives provide direct training to workers, while the IT initiative is focused on increasing and enhancing the pipeline of IT talent through deep employer engagement with educational institutions at all levels. The analysts found that successful programs involve employers who are actively and substantively engaged. They provide advice on curricula, directly interact with students, and tend to come from the highest ranks of their organizations so that they're free to speak on behalf of the employers. The case studies also showed that relationships and trust among employers and partners are important drivers of success. Trust is necessary because in many cases the employers are competitors. Sustained relationships among the many partners are important because they give the initiatives time to evolve and to grow. Now, many of you are probably familiar with an initiative called Shaping Our Appalachian Region, or SOAR. This effort bears many of the leadership and collaboration qualities that are critical to supporting economic transitions. Since its inception in 2013, SOAR has embarked on building a set of working committees that allow individuals and institutions to join together to steer the course of economic revitalization in the region. The leadership and collaboration displayed by SOAR are straight out of the Resurgent Cities playbook. The leaders involved recognize that it's in their own best interest to support economic rebirth, and that collaboration is essential because the process of economic transition is necessarily complex. By providing an easy-to-access venue for Eastern Kentucky's organizations, businesses, civic leaders, and private citizens to come together and plan for a stronger economic future, SOAR also provides the essential foundation to effect change. One concrete example of success is a new associate's degree program in broadband technology at Big Sandy Community and Technical College. This is the first such program in Kentucky and only the 3rd in the country. According to the college's president, the program came about in large part because of the coordinated work of SOAR, Kentucky public officials, and One East Kentucky, a 9-county regional organization comprising private businesses and local chambers of commerce. One of the areas SOAR is targeting is workforce development, and wisely so. Just as investments in physical capital, such as plants, equipment, and software, can make businesses more productive, so can investments in human capital, educational and training programs that allow people to become and remain productive members of the modern labor force. Now, when it comes to the economic well-being of entire regions, many studies have documented the importance of investments in human capital. For example, Cleveland Fed researchers found that over a 75-year period, education levels were consistently one of the most reliable indicators for each state's per capita income growth, and that counties with higher levels of high school graduates tend to have lower poverty rates and higher levels of labor force participation. A study by a Cleveland Fed researcher found that resilient regions, that is, regions that have been able to avoid persistent declines in population over the longer run, tend to have a more educated population and a more diverse industry mix. The benefits of investing in human capital are also evident at the individual level. For individuals, better education is correlated with lower levels of unemployment and higher wages. For example, at the national level, the current unemployment rate for those with a college degree is 2.5%, compared to 5% for those with a high school diploma and 6.3% for those who didn't graduate from high school. The difference in wages between those without those with a college degree and those without, the so-called skill premium, has widened substantially over time, more than doubling since the 1970s. And over a lifetime in present value terms, a college graduate can expect to earn nearly twice as much as a high school graduate. Most studies have tended to focus on the benefits of a college education because that's where the data are more readily available. But other approaches to workforce development are also needed. Technological change and globalization have been changing the nature of the jobs available in the U.S. Those workers who have been displaced from their current occupations, for example, the coal miners and assembly line workers, often need to retrain for the modern economy. Apprenticeships, certificate programs, and on-the-job training can all potentially play an important role in getting people back into productive jobs. The Registered Apprenticeship Program, administered by the Employment and Training Administration's Office of Apprenticeship within the U.S. Department of Labor, is in conjunction with the state apprenticeship agencies. The apprenticeship programs offer structured, on-the-job training combined with related technical instruction tailored to industry needs in a variety of occupations, including electricians, plumbers, truck drivers, and child-care workers. One study of the program covering 10 states, including Kentucky, found that the program has been highly effective in generating higher incomes for participants in a cost-effective way. In the 9th year after enrollment, the average person who had participated in the program was earning almost $6,000 more in annual salary compared to non-participants. And the difference in lifetime earnings amounted to about $98,000. These differences were even greater for those who completed the apprenticeship programs. For Kentucky, data limitations precluded looking at earnings in the 9th year after enrollment, but in the 6th year after enrollment, the average participant in Kentucky was earning over $5,700 more per year than the average non-participant. The study also concluded that the estimated social benefits of the program exceeded the social costs. In some, the study's evidence suggested that effective apprenticeships not only lead to higher earnings, but also help people stay employed longer. While it's important to help people already in the labor force transition to other occupations in high demand, it's also important to start training people still in school so that they can develop the skills for the jobs of the future, and to make sure that those providing that education and training understand what the jobs in demand will be. The Allegheny Conference on Community Development commissioned an in-depth analysis of the supply and demand for labor in the Pittsburgh region over the next decade. The resulting report made a number of recommendations to help prepare employers, current and future workers, educators, and civic leaders for the coming changes. One initiative would create a digital career awareness hub for students and teachers in kindergarten through high school to better match curriculum to the skill sets in demand in the future. Another would create a digital jobs database to make it easier to match those with particular skills to employers currently needing those skills. A further recommendation is to focus resources on high-growth opportunity occupations, positions that pay higher than the median wage but don't require a bachelor's degree. This diverse group of occupations includes certain jobs in healthcare, transportation, and bookkeeping. Research by the Federal Reserve suggests that even in opportunity occupations, employers are demanding higher levels of skills than they did in the past. So aligning skill development with these types of jobs will need to be a priority. And it's important to note that not all the necessary skills are technical ones. The Cleveland Fed's case studies of sector-based training programs that I mentioned earlier found that even if a job seeker meets the technical skill requirements for a position, lacking the necessary soft skills can be a significant barrier to employment. By their very nature, soft skills, such as the ability to work in teams and effective communication, are difficult to measure. But studies are now examining the role of characteristics like persistence and other personality traits as they relate to labor market outcomes. The ACT Work Keys test attempts to measure foundational and soft skills, and Kentucky is using it as a metric to help evaluate whether a community has the infrastructure and workforce sought by employers. Among Kentucky's most successful retraining efforts is the Hiring Our Miners Every Day, or HOME program. Housed within the Eastern Kentucky Concentrated Employment Program, HOME is funded by an emergency grant from the U.S. Department of Labor, and as its name implies, helps miners and their families affected by the decline in the coal industry. HOME appreciates that displaced miners are far from unskilled. Rather, they need the opportunity to hone their skills for different industries. For example, the HOME program puts out-of-work miners through a course to prepare them for work as electrical utility linemen, a job that not only pays well, but also provides much-needed fiber optic lines to rural areas. As a result of this program, Eastern Kentucky may be able to keep a share of its skilled workforce in the region, thereby helping the local economy to grow. HOME is also an example of community leadership and collaboration in action, as it brings together a wide range of entities and interlocking relationships, from the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce to Hazard Community and Technical College. An important next step will be for the partners to undertake a focused evaluation of the program so that we can all learn which specific strategies work and why they work, and which strategies are less effective and therefore less deserving of continual investment. The final factor I'll discuss today that's been found to help in revitalizing distressed communities is investment in infrastructure. In fact, infrastructure is a critical component of economies of all sizes. The Appalachian Development Highway System started in 1965 as a key piece of Eastern Kentucky's infrastructure. This system includes 3,000 plus miles of highways across 13 states and was designed for the express purpose of linking otherwise isolated and distressed areas of Appalachia through the interstate highway system. Several studies have documented that economic activity is higher in places connected by the highway. Of course, in 2016, the regional infrastructure needs of vibrant businesses and households have expanded to include not only the physical highway, but also the digital highway. Broadband internet access has become a necessity in our connected world. A recent report issued by Cornell University found that non-metropolitan counties that have had a higher rate of broadband adoption have also experienced higher growth in median household income and lower rates of job loss than similarly situated counties that have had low broadband adoption. A 2013 federal government report on broadband access and adoption found that adoption rates vary by household income levels. Fewer than half of households with incomes below $25,000 a year use broadband at home, compared with over 90% of households with annual incomes exceeding $100,000. There's also wide disparity in broadband access, especially access to high-speed broadband between rural and urban areas, putting the growth prospects of rural areas at a disadvantage. Eastern Kentucky stands to benefit from Kentucky Wired, a statewide effort to bring broadband access to underserved areas in the state. I note that the Community Reinvestment Act, CRA, provides a significant opportunity to boost programs like this aimed at closing the digital divide. Recent revisions to the CRA rules recognize that a reliable communications infrastructure, such as broadband internet access, can help to revitalize or stabilize underserved non-metropolitan middle-income areas. So depository institutions will now receive credit for investing in this infrastructure for the purposes of meeting the CRA requirement of serving the needs of low and moderate income communities. Let me conclude by noting that the economy has made significant strides in coming back from the Great Recession. The unemployment rates in both the nation and in Eastern Kentucky are down about 5 percentage points since their respective peaks during the accommodative monetary policy has provided important support to the economy on this cyclical journey, helping to promote improving labor markets. But we need to recognize that the labor market outcomes for people in Eastern Kentucky are below the national average, and there continue to be longer-run challenges in regions like Eastern Kentucky that are undergoing economic transformation. Technological advances and globalization are changing the nature of available jobs and the skill sets needed to perform those jobs. To raise our shared standard of living and to make us more competitive in the global economy, the U.S. needs to ensure that people can enter and remain productive members of the transforming economy. Now, you may have heard that last week I and several other Federal Reserve System leaders met with representatives from the Center for Popular Democracy's Fed Up campaign in a public forum held before the Fed's annual symposium in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. I think it was a very productive exchange of views about how to solve some of the labor market challenges still afflicting certain communities and demographic groups. Like the Fed Up campaign, I believe these are important challenges that the country needs to address. But unlike the Fed Up campaign, I do not believe that at this point in the business cycle, the current very low level of interest rates is an effective solution to these longer run issues. But the good news is that programs that I discussed today and many of the other efforts underway can make a real difference to the people and communities in transition. Now, to be sure, these programs are but a small part of the overall strategy needed to support economic transitions. Laying the foundation for sustained economic growth is neither a quick nor an easy task. It involves many different players working together with perseverance. I commend this audience for undertaking this effort. As members of the Kentucky Philanthropy Initiative and related charities, you provide leadership and foster collaboration, key ingredients to revitalization and resiliency of our regions. Like the KPI, the Federal Reserve takes seriously its role as a convener. Bringing together people to share their different perspectives and experiences can ultimately lead to more effective economic policies. I've spoken many times about how the diversity of views expressed around the FOMC table helps the Fed make better monetary policy. I believe the same is true for public policies aimed at addressing the challenges faced in community development. KPI performs an invaluable service by pulling together people and groups to support grant making and to promote public-private partnerships targeting the region's persistent challenges. The Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland looks forward to our continued collaboration with you in these efforts. Thank you very much for your attention, and now I think we have time for a few questions and perhaps a few answers.
I'm Jordan Huizinga from Children Inc. Up in northern Kentucky. I guess maybe talk a little bit about, and you touched on this, we heard a little bit about this earlier this morning too, about workforce participation and how as a state we can begin to address those workforce participation while unemployment are at historic lows, workforce participation rates are also at historic lows. While that is also kind of balanced with an enormous amount of baby boomers leaving the workforce and retiring, there are a number of other issues that go into that. So maybe talk a little bit about the workforce participation specifically and how we might be able to address that as a state.
Yeah, so no doubt you're exactly right. If you look at workforce participation rates, and I'll say at a national level, right, they have been going down. And that was really exacerbated right after the Great Recession. You just saw people leaving the workforce because they couldn't get, discouraged workers. They were in the workforce, they lost their jobs, they left the workforce. Now there is a downward trend in workforce development, a longer run trend that's based on demographics, some of which are what you said in terms of, people retiring from the baby boom generation, but also people now understanding that they need to stay in school longer to get the college degree. So there's demographics affecting both sides. Our estimates are that basically we're about back on trend at a national level on the labor force participation rate. So, we were way under trend, now we're back to about trend, but we should expect that to continue to go down. What that means is that if you look at employment growth, right, we shouldn't expect to see employment growing 200,000 jobs per month every month, right? Now that the labor force participation rate has come down, it means that employment growth probably will be somewhere, and it depends on the model and what you assume about demographics going forward, between 75 and 150 is enough to keep the unemployment rate constant. In areas where, right, we've had a loss of a big industry and there's less diversification, the problems are more severe because people haven't been able to gain the skills yet to come back into the jobs going forward. So the programs that we've talked about this morning and that some of the ones I mentioned in terms of training, job training to get people back in the workforce are going to be the kinds of things that you need to do, right, to bring the participation rate back up to the trend, national trend in areas that have been hard hit. I was able to see at Hazard Community College, see the lineman training program yesterday. A number of us got to actually see, and it was gratifying. I was very gratified to be able to actually talk to people in the program. There's a class of 28 that will be graduating tomorrow. They're having their graduation ceremony, so I got to talk to a number of them. And what really struck me was the dedication they had to this program, the ability to actually do it. Like, what struck me is there's no way in the world I would ever be able to do that job. Like, no way. I couldn't, there's like just no conceivable way I could do it, which just points out to me, like, we need diverse skill sets, right? We cannot all be the same person, right? So going to college is great, but other programs like the apprenticeship programs are very important as well. And, I'm an economist and we study things and we get data and study things. So a lot of the studies, of course, are based on college because that's where we got the data from. But now, right, there are a lot of programs out there that do these apprenticeship programs, and that's great. So while I can't do their job and I'll never be able to be an electrical fiber optic lineman, I rely on their work because, I read my speech off of this gizmo, right? I rely on broadband access every day. I rely on electricity every day. We need the diversity. We all want to be productive members of the workforce. And so I think the work that's going on here and the programs that are going on, and I love my community development staff because they make me aware of all these neat things that are happening. I think that's what we have to do. And I mentioned Fed Up, and of course they are arguing for keeping interest rates very, very low, and that'll be the catalyst to get people back into the workforce. I think that was exactly right after the Great Recession hit, and we did that. We lowered interest rates. I think at this point, it's really these kinds of programs, right? Fiscal policy actions and public-private partnerships and apprenticeship programs that can address those issues.
Thank you, Dr. Lester. So my question is about CRA and investment in microenterprise. And specifically as we look at a 21st century, or as Chris Kimmel mentioned, the 22nd century economy, And it's difficult for any one of us to really project what jobs of the future really look like when we really look to the next generation, 2 and 3 generations out. But we do know that a mindset of entrepreneurial activity will be critically important, both at a global level as well as a community level. So what is the role of CRA in investing in or funneling money through microenterprise in areas like Eastern Kentucky?
That's an excellent question. So the CRA rules recently, as I mentioned in the speech, have recognized the importance of broadband access. I think that there are a number of people who believe that, you know, the programs that are counted in CRA need to be expanded in some of the areas that you're talking about. But there are avenues in terms of the investment test and other parts of that that can be used to support some of those activities. There's a whole transformation, as you know, going on in financial services in terms of, we mentioned this morning, the unbanked, right? A lot of younger people don't ever step into a bank. They don't use a bank. They don't. So there's a whole effort to think about, right, what's that banking, financial, payment system going to look like in the future? And, you know, how can we make sure that all people have access to financial services? It doesn't necessarily have to be a bank. It can be others. And how do you balance sort of that? My own view is that's coming, but at the moment, right, community banks play a vital role, right, in the neighborhoods and communities we're talking about. So I feel a little bit like, you know, the Great Recession happened. We've denigrated the banking industry, but in some sense, the community banks are very vital partners with the communities that we're talking about that need investment, help to communities, help to farmers, help to, you know, the coal miners that are having to figure out how to maintain their households while they're transitioning and training. So I think that every party, including the banks, but including new kinds of financial services, are going to be part of it. And, you know, I take your point about CRA. A lot of times the regulations take a while to sort of get up to date with some of the new things that are going on. But I can tell you that there are people within the Federal Reserve who are thinking about that issue.
Any other questions? Okay, I think
All
that's
right.
it.
Thank you very, very much.